So that's why, had Odysseus given himself over to gardening, his humanly cultivated patch of ground would appear to us as a kind of oasis, if we could see it. An oasis of care in the landscape of Calypso's otherwise carefree world and island. So although our earthly, man-made gardens may evoke or recreate images of Eden, they always retain a human signature that reveals in their aspects the fact that human hands have brought them into being. And it's this signature, call it the mark of Kura, that would make Odysseus' garden stand out in Calypso's home world. Now, if we compare the parable of Kura with the story of Adam and Eve in Genesis, we find that there are certain affinities and yet very marked differences as well. In Genesis, God seems to have created a carefree Adam and put him in the Garden of Eden as if to shield him from the reality of things. You know how parents are, especially these days, very concerned to shield their children from reality. And it seems like the God of Genesis had a similar concern for Adam. The irony is that he puts Adam into the Garden of Eden and says to him that he must keep it. He must become the caretaker of its environment. And yet how can God possibly expect Adam to become a caretaker when he took such pains to make sure that his creature did not have a care in the world? The extent to which Adam and Eve are carefree or careless is most evident to me in the kind of casual manner in which they performed that momentous act that gets them expelled from the garden. Quote, "And when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eye, and a tree to be desired to make one wise, she took of the fruit thereof, and did eat, and gave also unto her husband with her, and he did eat." That's all that Genesis says about the motivation. Doesn't mention anything about overbearing pride, nor irrepressible curiosity. This is not necessarily a rebellion against God. In fact, there's not even that heady thrill of transgression. But in that one mindless innocence, their act was committed without fear and trembling, without any drama of temptation or fascination of the forbidden. In fact, it was without motivation at all. It was out of sheer carelessness that they did it. But how could it have been otherwise? Again, given the way God deprived them of the means to cultivate a sense of responsibility. So the problem with Adam and Eve in the garden was not so much their will to disobedience as their flaky, thoughtless dispositions. In Eden, Adam was unburdened by worries, but by the same token, he was also incapable of devotion. And without devotion, our humanity cannot realize its potential. Every story that comes to us from myth tells us this. In Eden, everything was there for Adam, including his wife. But after his exile, he was there for everything else. For it was only by dedicating himself, or only by committing himself, that he could render inhabitable an environment that exacted his labor. Out of this kind of self-commitment was born the love of something other than oneself. Hence was born the possibility of human culture as such. But nowadays, the more successful we are in recreating Edenic conditions for ourselves, the more we revert back to that single-minded love of oneself, rather than love of something that is not oneself. And no human being is happy when self-love is the only love that's left to him or her. Because human beings are fully human only when things matter. Nothing was at stake for Adam and Eve in the garden. Nothing was at stake until suddenly, in one decisive moment, self-revelation, everything was at stake. So these were the garden's impossible alternatives. Live in moral oblivion within its limits, or acquire awareness at the cost of being thrown out. I know many among us would opt to live in moral oblivion within the limits of that world. But others of us would pay the price of the fall in order to be handed over to our humanity. I would like to suggest that not Adam, but Eve is the progenitor of humanity. It's thanks to her that there are any progenitors at all. And if she has to take the blame for the fall from Eden, she should also get the credit for it. Because it was the fall, finally, that turned husband into father, wife into mother, and gave this very childlike couple a parental maturity they could never have achieved had they not found their way out of that protected environment. In fact, it seems that there was no fecundity of generations in Eden. It's only after the fall that procreation comes into the picture, into the human story. And why is that? Because where there is no death, there is no birth either. That's why the expulsion was not only a fall into mortality, and everyone wants to insist on the fall into mortality and blame Eve for that. We're still blaming Eve to a certain extent for that. It was also a fall into what Hannah Arendt called natality, by which she meant the possibility of initiation of new beginnings through human action. Let's go back to Odysseus for a moment. By choosing mortality over immortality, in other words, by rejecting Calypso's offer, Odysseus repeats that fateful choice that Eve made, and in so doing he proves himself to be an adult. Gilgamesh is still a kid. He's still an adolescent. Odysseus is a more mature individual. Through that choice to embrace his mortality, he reaffirms his place in the genealogical line that makes of mortal life a link in the chain of generations. It's always about the land of the fathers, and it's only in the land of his fathers that Odysseus finally reclaims that human identity. And what does that mean, his human identity? It doesn't mean his self, his inner self, his true self. No. It means an identity that defines him as the son of Laertes and Anticlea, the husband of Penelope, and the father of Telemachus. That's what the coordinates of his human identity amount to. But it's Eve. She's the one who allowed boys to become men, and she's the one who turned Adam into Odysseus. In fact, I received a postcard the other day from Italy, and it shows an image of a painting in a church in Anacapri, 1761, Leonardo Chiaese. It's an image of the expulsion, Adam and Eve being forced out of the garden. Adam looks completely stricken and desolated by the event, and Eve is up there in a almost, I wouldn't want to say joyous, but it looks like she's looking forward to a future with eager anticipation, while Adam is there lost and at a loss. And why wouldn't Eve rejoice about the expulsion? After all, she was created, what was she? She was a Stepford wife. She was created as a Stepford wife with everything provided for her. Everything except the prospect of self-fulfillment. The same was true for Adam, yes, in a certain sense, impressionistically speaking. But he does seem to have less dread of the mindless, ultimately feckless happiness that this couple was expected to enjoy in their garden. And that's probably because he did not hear the call of natality as intensely as Eve. Eve's transgression was itself already an act of motherhood, for through that act of eating the fruit, she gave birth to the mortal human self which realizes its potential in the unfolding of time, be it through work, procreation, art, or the contemplation of things divine. God should have foreseen that. He should have foreseen that by endowing Eve with a potential for natality, He made it painful for her to endure the sterile mirror which the garden reflected back on her. One of Eve's daughters, Eleanor Wilner, contemporary poet, describes the sterility of that mirror in a poem of hers called A Moralized Nature is Like a Garden Without Flowers, from a remarkable collection called The Girl with Bees in Her Hair. Here's that poem. And nowhere in the shade of those verboten trees was there the feel of cool moss underfoot, never the veils of water, gravity flung, over the edges of granite into the dark that pools below. No restless hours, no bug-eyed frog unfurling its tongue, no insect hum of propagation, no busy messengers of change, nowhere the silken bowers of desire into which the bees plunge, drunk on nectar and remembrance of the larval honey lust. No flowers in Eden, not even one. I'm inclined to trust Wilner's ancestral memory of that place, Eden, I mean, because no one has a deeper reach into primal things than Eleanor Wilner, from which I just quoted. That there was fruit without flowers in Eden suggests that it was a frozen, temporally suspended nature which reigned there. That poem goes on about beauty, how beauty had no figure. Why? Because without generation and decay, there is no beauty. Here is how the poem continues. Beauty had no figure, no sacred symmetry, centripetal, slowly opening to a half-glimpsed nuclear core, hot enough to melt the Arctic, ice-bound heart of God. One flower in Eden, and they would have known beauty, and knowing that, would know how beauty fades.